is looking very, very beautiful, covered with a layer of whiteness. Whoops, the screen has put me up. I'll change back to gallery view. Prefer to have be able to see everyone. Not everyone's here as yet, so we'll keep waiting for some others to arrive. I love the silence of snow. There's something about snow that I suppose it has that effect of sort of dampening sound and falls very silently. It changes the atmosphere considerably, I think. Yeah, landscape of snow is very, very different. Has anyone else got snow where you are? Yes, Viniparianaya has. No, Brigitte in Germany, no. Lots of shaking of the head, so I guess it's not that widespread. Can you hear me all right? Yep, thumbs up, that's good. Okay, we're up to 26 of us, so there's still a few to arrive. So I hope you all had a good night, and yeah, that you feel you're on retreat, that you are managing to yeah, create that space to feel that you're on retreat. But also, you know, one of the benefits certainly that yeah, I find doing a home retreat is that actually it allows you to bring so much more awareness to your everyday life, you know, to your everyday life at home. There's always that thing, you know, when you're on retreat and, you know, heightened awareness and the feeling that, you know, you're able to just be more present, be more mindful, and then you get home and life takes over and you lose some of that. But doing home retreats, you know, the advantage is that you can bring all that into your daily life and have an experience of what it's like, which I think really helps ongoingly after the retreat. So hopefully you'll find it's like that for you. Okay, so we're up to 29. So I'll probably just proceed. Samantha Badri is up in the elevated position today, up in the lofts. Good morning, Samantha Badri. I have to say it is quite strange, you know, being co-leading a retreat when we're not in a bubble together, so we're having to socially distance, and yes, it's a very different experience doing it this way. I mean, doing it on Zoom is different anyway, but also, you know, not having your team around you, as it were. So, an experiment. So this morning, anyway, we're going to be looking at compassion. Another, well, it's one of the Brahma Viharas, and it's very much Meta's expression when it comes into contact with the suffering world. I wanted to start by just reading a few lines that Avalokiteshvara says. It's from the Gandavyuha Sutra, and Avalokiteshvara says these lines to Sudana, the truth seeker. He says, I know a gate of liberation, the embryo of knowledge, of clouds of compassion of all the Buddhas, born of my own love and operating everywhere to protect and care for all beings. So beautiful to hear him speak of it as being born from his own love. Compassion is born of love, combined with wisdom. And this has been a year when compassion has been needed like no other that I've known in my lifetime. It's tested us to the limit, and there's not yet an end to it. One of the great gifts to come from the tragedies of the year has been the huge compassionate response from so many people. It's clear that just countless of ordinary, so-called ordinary people have seen a need during this year and responded, going so far beyond themselves in order to help. And it's just been such an inspiration to hear about these people. There's also been a lot of talk over the last few months, certainly this year, in the order, stemming, I think, largely from the latest book from Análio, where he's looking at the difference between empathy and compassion, which I found really helpful. I think it's good to just really try and understand, what is empathy and what is compassion. I definitely mistook empathy for compassion for a long time. Being someone who related more strongly to suffering, indeed identified myself with suffering, I was able to relate very directly to another's suffering, and took this at the time to be compassion, but then later came to realize that in fact it was empathy. Pure empathy is a contemplation of dukkha rather than compassion. It's a very precious gift to be able to relate to another's suffering, especially when you can truly see it from their point of view, when you can, really put yourself in their shoes, as it were. And this is crucial because, when somebody tells us about their suffering, tells us about a situation in which they're suffering, very often we immediately relate it to something that's happened to us, and tell them all about it, tell them about what's happened to us, thinking that we're actually commiserating with them. But instead, of course, actually we've failed to really hear them, failed to hear their distress, failed to take them in so that we can respond appropriately. And this is the difficulty that arises when you get too caught up in their suffering, when it becomes more about you because of what it's triggered for you. My tendency to overemphasize meant that this was something I often experienced to the extent that I was sometimes taking another's suffering in as my own. So then we were both suffering, which of course did little to relieve the other person's suffering, and clearly isn't compassion. So this is where Avalokiteshvara came in, was really helpful for me, holding me in the intensity of my response to suffering, but showing me that compassion doesn't get caught up in that way. It contemplates the healing of dukkha, of the dukkha, and sees that often the main causes of suffering are actually how we react to it rather than what has happened. So it's empathy with another's suffering and compassion for suffering. The compassionate response, of course, wants to relieve the suffering. Like metta, it's an action. It's this felt wish to do something to bring the suffering to an end, to imaginatively connect with whatever might bring it about. And this can actually be a really joyful thing to contemplate. We've been doing the bodhicitta practice as an order throughout most of this very difficult year. And one of the wonderful things in this practice, you know, when you've been really contemplating the suffering world, really taking in the suffering world, wanting through your aspiration to relieve it, if the practice is really working well, you really find yourself turning karana into mudita in the practice, which is such a joyful thing. So, yeah, the contemplation can actually bring about a sense of a shift in perspective. Of course, it's not always possible to do anything about it. Just thinking about the suffering world today, the extent of it, it's just very hard not to become overwhelmed and feel powerless in the face of it. Compassion's function resides in its inability to tolerate suffering, so it motivates the desire to help when others suffer. Compassion is spacious, allowing things to be the way they are, knowing things change and come to an end, but it cannot be complacent. It must act if it can. It bears witness. And with that witnessing comes an understanding of what's possible. So that sometimes you recognize that you can only stand alongside those who are suffering. The important thing to know that compassion doesn't lose perspective and get brought down by its failure to be able to relieve it. It still longs for that and keeps faith that things will change. So it isn't that you enter into someone else's suffering in a way that means you too are suffering, as I said before. This is just adding to the dukkha of the situation, and then, of course, you're not able to truly help. The real compassionate response is the wish, the longing to relieve it, and whatever comes from that. Avalokiteshvara has been lighting the way for me on compassion, the compassion front, for many years. Although it's often daunting, to say the least, to have him as your guide. His love and compassion is so boundless, so pure, so utterly uncompromising. He tells Sudana, the truth seeker of the Gandavyuha, that it's good he aspires to supreme perfect enlightenment. And he then tells him, I know a way of enlightening practice called undertaking great compassion without delay, which sets about impartially guiding all sentient beings to perfection. And that's the key, isn't it? Impartially guiding all sentient beings to perfection. He goes on to say, I take care of them and develop them according to their mentalities, and by showing conduct according to their inclinations, and by magically producing various forms, and by teaching them doctrines commensurate to their various interests, and by inspiring them to begin to accumulate good qualities, by appearing to them as members of their own various races and conditions, and living together with them. What I've quoted here is only part of the passage, but I'm sure you get the message. He's seeing what they need and responding accordingly. This is so beautiful and moves me deeply. The way he wants to engage completely with them, meeting them absolutely on their terms in order that he might relieve their suffering. The extremes he will go to, his preparedness to do whatever is required, highlights how conditioned my own responses are. But how can I let that deter me when the world is suffering as it is? To be deterred would again be all about me rather than the suffering world. It's certainly a challenge. But when the heart is drawn towards boundlessness, it's not dragged down by the suffering. Instead, it's uplifted with the wish to relieve it. Throughout this difficult year, it's been clearer than ever before that Karana and Mudita, two of the Brahma Viharas, which are very much Meta's response to suffering and joy, suffering and happiness, they need to be in balance. Karana and Mudita need to be in balance. One of the images I love for the Brahma Viharas is that of a bird in flight. The body of the bird is Metta, its wings, Karana and Mudita, and the whole bird in flight is equanimity. This image gives you a strong sense of how connected the Brahma Viharas are to each other. But it also gives a clear indication that in order for the bird to fly, both wings need to work to be balanced. So it's really interesting just to look at yourself in this respect. What is your connection with Karana and Mudita? Do you relate more strongly to one or the other, or are they fairly balanced? For me, for many years, my focus was Karana. As I said earlier, I identified with suffering. Mudita didn't really exist for a long time, not until I realized something was off kilter and decided to do something about it. I took on to practice Mudita for a year, and it was a revelation. Opening to life through appreciation, gratitude, and rejoicing brings a quality to life that, even though difficult and painful at times, is a true gift. And of course, and perhaps most importantly, it gives you the resources to be able to meet the suffering elements in life in a way that is more truly compassionate. Having these two in balance is what makes it possible to bear the suffering world with more equanimity, which is really what we need, rather than being dragged down by it or getting overwhelmed. This leads neatly on to the near enemies of compassion. If you're familiar with the Brahma Viharas, you'll know these are ways that we can respond that look like the real thing, but isn't. There are two of them for Karana, probably because it's so difficult not to get drawn in unhelpful ways. The first is sentimental pity. That's the sort of there approach, which doesn't actually engage with the suffering at all and is disconnected from what's really going on. It can be really hard when somebody uses this approach when you're in the midst of suffering, just telling you that everything will be all right, smoothing it all away. Then there's horrified anxiety, which is when it's all too much and threatens to overwhelm you. This can be really difficult to deal with when it happens to you. But the important thing to recognize, as with all the near enemies, that it is actually more about you than what's happening. It's more about you than the suffering that's before you. And you can probably see that both of these lack perspective and true connection. If we are overcome by grief and sorrow in relation to suffering, we're not able to respond in a clear and open-hearted manner, and therefore to act appropriately. We very probably need to attend to our own inner need when this happens, holding ourselves with an open, compassionate heart. One of the ways within the Brahma-Vihara mandala that you can restore balance if you find yourself in the near enemies of Karuna is to turn to metta or to turn to mudita. You can go in either direction. Both of them bring about a shift in perspective, help you regain perspective. And this is one of the lovely ways that the Brahma Viharas work together as a mandala of practices. The far enemy of Karuna is cruelty. So Karuna is the antidote to cruelty. Compassion is the antidote to cruelty. As with all the far enemies, we may think we don't need to worry too much about them. They're far too extreme for us. But I know from my own experience that they can manifest in many subtle ways. Cruelty can come out in all sorts of ways, perhaps particularly in our speech, a cutting comment, a put down that just comes out. And then, of course, there's the inner world in which we live, the private moments that only we are party to. We can be very cruel to ourselves, often without even realizing it. So it really pays to listen to the voice when we talk to ourselves, just being aware of how we are in relation to ourselves. I want to read those lines that I started with again. I know a gate of liberation, the embryo of knowledge, of clouds of compassion of all the Buddhas, born of my own love and operating everywhere to protect and care for all beings. Very beautiful words of Avalokiteshvara. What I'd like us to do now is just sit, get into our meditation posture. And we're just going to have a little reflection period, which I'll lead us through. One of the things I always enjoy when we're all sitting here together in the shrine room is those moments when everyone gets themselves settled getting everything just right for your meditation. So it's lovely just to see you all engaged in this on the screen here, connecting with you all. As we close our eyes, turn our senses within. So, what do you find there in your inner world? How are you this morning? Just connecting. Just feeling present with yourself, with your body, with your heart and your mind. Just aware of what's there, how things are. A kindly awareness that's able to hold whatever's happening with an open, spacious heart. And when you feel ready, just reflecting a bit as we did yesterday with metta, reflecting on compassion in your own life. This may stretch far back into your life, into the whole of your life, not just from when you came across the Dharma. And thinking about it in relation to you yourself, how that's expressed in your life, but also how you've received compassion in your life. Different situations may have brought about a compassionate response from family and friends and others. Maybe look particularly since you started practicing the Dharma, since you started meditating, maybe doing the Brahma Viharas, the Karana Bhavana, Maybe thinking about those two wings of the bird, Karuna and Mudita, compassion and sympathetic joy or gladness. Are you drawn more towards one than the other? Is there any balance there? Or does one need attention to bring it into balance? Just reflecting perhaps on how much more difficult it is to face one or the other when there isn't that sense of balance, of perspective. thinking about the difference between empathy and compassion. How do you relate to that in your own experience? And the near enemies, sentimental pity, horrified anxiety. Just looking at yourself in relation to them. Do you have a tendency towards one or the other? Brushing it under the carpet on the one hand, smoothing it all away. Or being overwhelmed. We need kindness and patience with ourselves if we find ourselves in these situations. Maybe find someone like Avalokiteshvara who can take you by the hand and show you the way. You're just recognizing what's getting triggered in you. bringing this about, tending to that. And of course, connecting with metta or mudita can help restore perspective. Compassion comes from the great love of the Buddha, the Bodhisattvas. The more we clear away those barriers that we've erected to protect ourselves, clear away the clouds, the more that love can shine through us. The greater our compassionate response can be. You all. Some people are still to arrive in their empty spaces, but no doubt they'll be along in a moment. Seems like most of you are back. So yeah, before going on with this morning, just want to apologise for a couple of omissions on my part. I had intended to tell you what the plan for the morning was, how we were going to proceed, what it was going to contain, and I forgot to do that. I had also intended that we were going to start with an arriving practice, just have a bit of time to settle in before I talked about compassion. And I think I'm adapting to these conditions. It's, I haven't quite caught up, I think, with doing things this way, so apologies. Anyway, we're going to, the idea is that we were going to continue this morning with Karanabhavana practice. Yeah, an opportunity to do that very, very beautiful practice, which feels, so appropriate in these times. I don't know whether everybody here has done the Karanabhavana before. I will lead us through, so if you haven't, don't worry, you've done the Metta Bhavana. I'm pretty sure of that. So, with a lead through, you'll be fine. But I wanted, in a way, just to talk a bit about approaches to the practice. Obviously, you have your own approaches, and you may be perfectly happy carrying on doing as you're doing, and that's fine. But some people do find, the Metta Bhavana and the other Brahma Vihara practices quite difficult because there's quite a lot involved, in terms of the stages and the different people. And it's a practice where you are connecting with emotion, which is not always easy. So one of the things I've thought quite a lot about the actual bhavana aspect of the practices, and for me it's very much about creating the conditions for something to arise. So being a gardener, when I'm sowing seeds, and I have these little tiny seeds in my hand that I'm going to plant into the garden. And I have to be really aware of what conditions they're going to need to actually allow them to, shoot and become the very beautiful flower or vegetable that they can become. So that requires, that I do kind of sit back a bit and think about these things. I don't just put it in the ground and expect that it's going to be okay. And I know what the conditions are that it needs, whether it needs more sun or a bit of sun and shade, whatever those conditions might be, making sure that the soil conditions are going to be good for it and so on. So if you can think about the bhavana aspect of your practice, a bit like this, what are the conditions that you need at this particular time? Just really kind of tending to yourself, to those seeds inside you that can, kind of blossom forth into metta or karuna, so that you give yourself the best opportunity. So in a way, for me, it's very much about not doing the practice too much. I think we can overdo it with these practices. So letting go, relaxing, really trusting that the heart knows the way. And if you can just kind of, sit back and have the intention of the practice, have that quite firmly in your heart and let it lead you in a way. certainly not doing it too much with your head. So yes, very much a more open, spacious sort of approach to the practice. Letting it reveal itself as it goes on, showing you what you need, just paying attention, being there, being present, and listening deeply. So the Karana Bhavana has an additional stage to the Metta Bhavana practice. So we start off with ourselves in just the same way as we do with the Metta Bhavana, just connecting with ourselves as fully as we can, having that open-hearted response to ourselves, to whatever's there, however we are in that moment. Just really connecting as much as we can in that way at the start of the practice. And then the next stage of the practice, you bring to mind someone who you know who is suffering at the moment. And it's generally suggested that you don't choose someone who's suffering in a really major way at the moment. Somebody who's suffering, but not in a way that's going to be, immediately perhaps overwhelming. And turn towards, in the practice, turning towards that person, and you don't have to do anything but meet them and meet their suffering as fully as possible, and notice what happens when you do this. Because there's a shift, there's a change. If there was metta there in your first stage, you'll notice a change in it as it moves towards Karana. Bhante has this lovely expression of it, having a shadow cast over it, your metta having a shadow cast over it when it becomes compassion. So the important thing is that you're meeting this person, turning towards this person who's suffering, and becoming aware of their suffering, in a sense, empathizing, putting yourself in their shoes, imagining what it's like for them, and really wanting them to be free of the suffering. And just letting the momentum of that carry you forward in the practice. It can just be very, very beautiful. It might be quite a subtle sense that you get, but whatever's there, just appreciating the connection, appreciating the wish to relieve their suffering, and being with that throughout that stage. And we then go on to the stages as for the Metta Bhavana. So then the good friend, the neutral person, the difficult person, and then of course bringing them all together and then out into the world. So is that clear enough for us to begin? Some nodding heads, thank you very much. Okay, so we'll settle down and trust that our heart knows the way. So does it feel good to be in your meditation posture, meeting yourself again this morning? The familiarity. Whatever is there in your experience. Connecting. Not pushing away or grasping after. Just turning towards. Turning towards the body. How does it feel this morning? Just setting yourself up, inhabiting it. Being with any aches and pains. Tender towards them. Whilst realizing large parts of the body feel fine. Recognizing you don't have to be holding yourself upright. You can surrender your weight to the earth. Sense of letting go. Letting it support you. So the spine and the upper body can open and expand, rising up to the sky. Connecting with your heart space. Maybe an image comes to mind of how it feels today. looking for openness. Connectedness, presence, being aware too of your mental activity. If it's dominating, focus more on the breathing body, just bringing your energy and awareness down into that. Just sitting with a sense of appreciation that you've given yourself this opportunity to be on retreat. It's an act of kindness to yourself. Just sensing the pleasure of being here, being alive, pleasure of the breath. A warm beating heart. And a mind turned towards the Dharma. And we're going to move into the second stage of the practice, bringing someone to mind, someone you know who is suffering at the moment. Just staying aware of what happens as you do this. Imagining you're with them, connecting with them. Seeing and understanding what's happening for them. Metta responds with the wish to relieve their suffering, for their suffering to come to an end, to act, to do something, to help relieve it. Just gently feeling your own heart respond and open to their suffering. If there's any sense of closing down, come back to metta. And try again when you feel ready. Just being with them, witnessing their suffering. Maybe holding them in a tender embrace. Moving on when you're ready to the next stage. Your good friend. Meeting them in the usual way, connecting. Feeling a heart response to your dear friend. Before turning your mind to the suffering in their lives. Noticing what happens as you do this. Just being aware of what you need. as you turn towards their suffering. Letting our friend go, just coming back to yourself for a moment, pausing. How are you doing? What do you need at this point to keep going forward? When you're ready, bring a neutral person to mind. Meeting them in the usual way. Recognizing your shared humanity. And then recognizing, although you won't know the details, there will be suffering in their life in some way. Opening your heart to that. Wishing them well, free from suffering and its causes. It's always interesting to notice the difference in our engagement with the neutral person compared with our dear friend. Remembering Avalokiteshvara's words, impartial. strengthening your engagement with this person. Who might be a dear friend if you knew them. Moving on to the next stage. Stopping briefly if you need to. And bringing a difficult person to mind. Noticing what happens as you do so. Does your heart stay open or close off a little as you connect with them? They suffer too. Can you connect with them on this basis? Can you see past your difficulties? See them more clearly. See their suffering. coming back to metta or going to mudita if you're in difficulty. Bringing this stage to a close. Bringing everyone together. You and the person who's suffering, your friend, neutral person, your difficult person. You sense an equal connection to each one, that they may be free from suffering and its causes. Then out into the suffering world. Everyone here at Taraloka and the surrounding areas, everyone where you are and the surrounding areas, spreading out in ever greater circles, encompassing the world. May all beings be well and happy, free from suffering and its causes. Letting it be a heartfelt wish. May all beings be well and happy, free from suffering and its causes.